The Altadena Library District is presenting this program as part of our participation in the Mental Health Initiative offered by the California State Library and the California Center for the Book. The Mental Health Initiative is a learning experience focusing on training and support for library staff to assist them in providing programming and fostering community partnerships related to mental health. The Altadena Library has received books for all age groups on topics related to mental well-being. The books will soon be available to our patrons for checkouts, and we thank the California State Library and the California Center for the Book for their funding. Once again, we are here with historian, editor, and author and speaker, Mitch Horowitz. And Mitch is going to be doing his Awakened Mind talk for us. And Mitch, thank you for visiting us at the Altadena Library District. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Very good to be here. And I want to say a word of thanks to the Altadena Public Library for hosting this forum, for making it available to the public. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to participate in a program that is open and available to the general public, although I would say not free. This is publicly funded, and I feel a sense of gratitude and debt not only to the patrons of the Altadena Public Library, but to all of you watching who support programs like this publicly, and they are hopefully to your benefit and to the benefit of others. This is obviously a very deeply serious time that we're going through. This is not a time for platitudes. This is not a time for stump speeches or rehearsed answers. And my hope is that this program, Awakened Mind, which will briefly explore with you the dimensions of positive mind metaphysics, will do so in a mature way, a practical way, an applicable way, a way that meets you where you live with the problems and crises of life and the things that we are all experiencing and participating in today. The name Awakened Mind is from a short book that I wrote maybe about 2 years ago that was an introduction of sorts to positive mind metaphysics. And the book came back to my attention and re-entered my heart very recently because the rights are being published in Arabic in Saudi Arabia. And for me, this is very significant because it is probably one of the first books of New Thought philosophy, New Thought being the umbrella term that we tend to use here in this country for positive mind metaphysics. It's one of the first books of New Thought, maybe the first, to be published in Arabic. So that's meaningful to me, and that returned me to the book. And when the library approached me about presenting a talk, I felt it was a good time to present a talk that's somewhat structured around that book. Now, this program is being launched in connection with the library's public health, mental health initiative. And for that reason, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to have universal applicability, and I want it to be useful, absolutely useful and practical for everyone who's watching. But I also must make a disclosure, and that is I'm not really a therapeutic speaker. I am a historian. I am a seeker in various spiritual realms. And when I say spiritual, I mean very simply the extra-physical. I mean very simply, not any specific religion or mode of thought, but a belief that part of the life we participate in is extra-physical in nature, that our minds have properties, in my outlook, that go beyond cognition and motor skills. And I believe that's an ardently defensible point of view, in fact, an absolutely necessary point of view here in the early 21st century. In addition to centuries of testimony from various seekers and individuals, we have so much evidence that the mind goes beyond its localized organ of the brain. At this point, we have so much evidence that the mind exhibits some sort of a causative force on events, on our biology, on our physicality, that I think it's well past time where we can avoid discussing questions of the extra physicality of the mind. Let me start with a very, very simple example, very non-controversial example, and that is the field of neuroplasticity, which I'm sure some of you watching have heard of. Neuroplasticity is a field of neuroscience that tracks through brain scans the manner in which your sustained thoughts alter the chemistry of your brain. And there's a brilliant clinical psychologist at UCLA, Jeffrey Schwartz, who years ago began treating patients who were experiencing either OCD or intrusive thoughts. And what Schwartz discovered is that if he could encourage patients over a course of many weeks to substitute other thoughts in place of whatever ritualized or obsessive thoughts they were experiencing, over time, the neural pathways associated with those thoughts would reroute in the brain as a literal actual fact. You could see through brain scans neural pathways altering over time. This is to say, the pathways through which electrical impulses travel in our brain as thoughts were altered. It was, in effect, mind over matter. We were seeing thoughts alter brain biology rather than vice versa. It was upending all the premises of materialism that we grew up with. No one challenges this data, but rarely do we deal fully with the implications of this data, which demonstrate to us a non-materialist view of life. There are many, many examples I could cite from many different fields: mind-body medicine, the placebo response, psychical research, quantum theory. There are many different directions I could go, but I'm going to limit myself to that one elementary example, because if you even accept, and no one challenges them, if you even accept the data from neuroplasticity experiments, it has to be acknowledged that we don't live in a world simply in which matter reproduces itself, but we live in a world in which our thoughts have actual control over elements of our brain chemistry. And for an event to be repeatable, for an event to be more than just an anomalous occurrence, there must be a consistency to it. And I think neuroplasticity has demonstrated that. But this also raises an interesting question, which many people encounter, sometimes with frustration, when they're approaching the question of mental causality, of mind over matter, of positive mind metaphysics. And that is, some people feel that things befall them, things befall nations, things befall entire populations of people that surely were not self-willed or self-derived. And I agree with that entirely. And I think one of the great blind spots of New Thought, a field to which I'm personally very dedicated, one of the great blind spots has been the assumption of this existence of an overall mental super law, sometimes called a law of attraction, this notion that we live under a law of mentality alone. I don't agree with that at all. I am contending that your thoughts and the influence that they exert in ways that go beyond ordinary cognition, motor skills, and so forth, your thoughts are one factor, one extra physical factor among many other factors in this world that we live in. There's no need to turn any of this into an orthodoxy or into a kind of foolish consistency. Is there a law of mental creativity? Well, a law, in order to be a law, must be consistent. If I were to venture that there's a law of mental creativity, I'd have to argue for some kind of consistency. So again, where's the consistency? We look around, we see a world in chaos. Our nation is reeling from all kinds of maladies, which people are out in the streets today trying to deal with, trying to solve. We're coming, knock wood, are we coming out of a coronavirus epidemic? We'll only know that in months to come. We're certainly struggling in the midst of it. And then there's the economic fallout, which I'm sure many of you are concerned about, and which I'll be speaking about shortly. So again, where's the consistency? Well, I would venture this. If I contend to you that your mind has some sort of causative impact on events, I would say that a law, in order to be a law, although it must be consistent, is not always felt consistency. Take the law consistently. Take the law of gravity, for example. You're going to experience gravity all the time. It's an ever-present, omnipresent phenomenon, but you experience gravity very differently here on planet Earth than you would on the moon, where you'd be able to jump 10 feet in the air, or on Jupiter, where you'd be crushed by your own weight. This is because gravity responds to mass. In a certain sense, you could even say that gravity is mass being attracted to itself. So in the vacuum of space, you're not going to experience gravity at all because there's an absence of mass. Introduce mass into space and you'll start to feel its effects. It's not that the law is wrong. It's not that it's a fantasy. It's not that it isn't ever operative, but it's mitigated by other circumstances. The law of mentality, if there is one, is mitigated by other circumstances. That's why myriad things can be going on all at once. And that's why I ardently disagree with some of my own colleagues who might insist that if something negative befalls an individual or befalls a nation, there's somehow some group collective mind at work. I don't agree with that. There's somehow some karma at work. I don't agree with that. I don't believe you just go cherry picking enormous ideas from other religions and other faiths in order to explain holes in your own. I would never use the term karma lightly. I also don't speak, as you may have surmised, in terms of manifestation or law of attraction or anything of that nature, because I think it's unclear. I think it's unclear. And maybe a little bit later on in this presentation, I'll defend to you the term that I do use, which is select. Select. I do think that we have a capacity to select from among multiple circumstances, again, in ways that just go beyond our ordinary cognition and motor function. But I do believe that our perspective, our assumptions, our emotionally charged thoughts, our mental pictures, our self-images do play a concrete role in impacting what happens to us, what experiences we enter into. Not an exclusive role, not an exclusive role, but a very concrete role. So in that vein, I want to get into some practical material because many of us in life right now are struggling with circumstances that are completely unprecedented, and we need practical help. Much of what I'm going to talk about is going to be personal, is going to be intimate. Obviously, I have my own deepest wishes, as many of you watching do, for policies that ameliorate problems. There are all kinds of problems in our society today that are announcing themselves in ways that none of us can ignore. Racial justice, the need for healthcare, economic inequality, and so on and so forth. And I have very strong feelings about policies to help ameliorate some of those things. But I'm not here to give a policy talk. I'm here to give a personal talk, a very intimate talk. And my wish is, and my hope is, that if some of what I'm going to say here today is of use to you, it will make you better able to do the things that need doing in this world, economically, socially, relationally, politically, whatever it may be. I want you in some way, to come away from this brief program feeling a greater sense of self-agency. And once you have a greater sense of self-agency, it'll make you effective it'll make you more effective in a wide variety of realms. So I want to explore some ideas that I believe are very simple, but very powerful. The first idea that I want to explore with you, in a certain sense, is maybe not a metaphysical idea at all, but it is so important that I feel the need to bring it to you today, right at the top of our time together. And it is the imperative to get away from cruel people in your surroundings. And I mean that in the plainest, simplest sense. I believe that we as a human community speak too little about cruelty, the kind of petty domestic or workplace cruelties that are visited upon us, that perhaps we sometimes visit upon others. I do believe that the hostilities that we demonstrate to one another, the cruelties that we demonstrate to one another, are a devastatingly difficult facet of life and must be spoken about bluntly and plainly. And I want to say the following to you. We all here in the early 21st century, we live in a very therapeutic culture. Therapeutic language and terminology abounds. We have been granted vocabulary in this time and place to discuss our needs. We have accepted many therapeutic ideas. Some of these ideas are very, very good ideas and very positive and helpful and useful ideas. But like all ideas that we come to accept after a couple of generations, they need revisiting, they need reevaluation, they need re-verification by you, the individual. One idea that I've been reevaluating in my own life and that I'm now sharing with you is this notion that we are often told, well, You can't change other people, so you have to fix yourself. You can't carpet the world, so better to wear slippers, which I think was something that was once said by the character Stuart Smalley on Saturday Night Live. We all accept this notion that in principle, since we can't affect the behavior of another, it's incumbent upon us to strengthen, fortify our sense of self, our self-image, our responses. I question this. Because I believe in my heart, and I have observed this as a seeker, and perhaps some of you have observed this too, that if you're in a position in which somebody is visiting hostility upon you, not necessarily even physical violence or abuse, but sometimes what we might call gaslighting or bullying you or insulting you and then engaging in plausible denial. Bullies always have plausible denial. Or someone doing something in a hostile way to you and then telling you, you're too sensitive. Always watch out for that term, you're too sensitive. Let me assure you, as a stranger, you may have no reason to trust me, but I ask for your trust. You are not too sensitive. When people tell you you're too sensitive, it's they're exercising plausible denial for bullying you, usually. I believe, in fact, that we have been oversold on the premise that painful relationships must result somehow in our forgiveness, our forbearance, our change of self. In fact, painful relationships frequently require a change of venue, and I mean with your feet. I mean getting away from cruel people. I mean burning your bridges behind you and not looking back. I mean that very literally. I have witnessed in my own life and in the lives of many other people an unbelievable flowering, an unbelievable opening when people suddenly find themselves in company with which they're compatible, in company where they feel understood, where they feel seen, where they feel listened to. There's a French satirist, his name is escaping me, but he said something that was very appealing at one time, and yet, again, that I question. He said, life is a hospital in which the patients are persuaded that they could get better if they could just keep switching beds. I think that insight and that point of view may have served people's needs when it was first uttered in the early 20th century. But I think today, in the early 21st century, we've lost sight of the fact that changing self is not necessarily what it's all about. That if you're in a friendship, in a relationship, in a domestic situation where there's a constant low-grade gnawing at your character, you must get away. You must get away. And some people tell me, hey, look, that's a nice ideal, but I might be tied to this person economically. I might depend upon this person financially. I might have other reasons why I'm stuck to and bound to this person domestically. I can't just get away from this person. And I honor that. I absolutely honor that. But I want to share with you a story. It's a historical story, and it's a story that must be understood in its very specific time and place. But it also has universal moral application, because the author of this profoundly important piece of history was a figure who himself spoke and wrote with universal moral application, and that was the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And I write about Frederick Douglass in my first book, Occult America, not exactly along the lines that I'm about to describe right now, but he's always been a figure that I've found not only profoundly important and valuable as a voice of human liberation, abolitionism, history, as a memoirist, but he's a universal moral philosopher. And I think he would want his work understood that way. If you've read any of Frederick Douglass's 3 memoirs, and I really encourage it, you'll recognize that in each of the 3 memoirs, Douglass wrote about the turning point of his life, something that he experienced when he was around 15 years old. At the age of 15, for various reasons. He was handed over to a horribly, horribly cruel slave owner named Edward Covey. Every slave owner, relatively speaking, was cruel, but Covey had a reputation for particular brutality. And Frederick, a young man of 15 at the time, was seen as some sort of a discipline problem. And so he got sent off to Covey to be broken, so to speak. And Covey was just a cruel, horrible figure who would subject him to daily beatings as he would many of the men and women who he held in bondage. The beatings got so bad that one day, Frederick, at age 15, escaped back to his old plantation. This was in Maryland. And he begged his old plantation owner to take him back in. And the plantation owner said no. And he sent Frederick, muddied up and caked with blood, back towards Covey's plantation. And Frederick was hiding in the woods and didn't know, outside of Covey's farm, and didn't know what to do. And Frederick was happened upon by a man named Sandy Jenkins. Sandy was a freed slave, and Frederick described Sandy as an old African medicine man who had known some of the old ways. And I write about this in Occult America, and I don't want to get too tangential, but perhaps historically it's important to mention. Sandy gave Frederick what Frederick described as a magic root. In fact, it so happens I have one of these roots in my pocket. It's known as a jalap root. It's a wonderful, magnificent object in the African American system of magic known as hoodoo. Not voodoo with a V, but hoodoo with an H. It was a beautiful, syncretic, combinative, magical, spiritual tradition, and it still is practiced today. Frederick wrote in his memoirs that Sandy gave him this so-called magic root and told him, this will protect you, and you need to go back to Covey's farm. If you don't go back, you could be killed. So you have to go back. So Sandy and his wife cleaned up Frederick, fed him, and Frederick returned to the farm. Now, when Frederick got back to the farm, he was absolutely shocked because Covey was polite to him. And Frederick thought, is this the magic root? What's going on here? And then he realized it was Sunday. And Covey, being a Sunday Christian, didn't beat people or whip people on Sundays. But the next day, Monday, when the sun rose, things were different. And Covey grabbed Frederick and dragged him into the barn and attempted to beat him, but something different happened. Frederick stood up to him. Frederick stood up to him. And the two struggled for about 2 hours, and Covey was unable to get the best of him. And Covey desisted, and Covey never pushed the point further. Frederick thought maybe Covey didn't push the point further because he had such a fearsome reputation and he would be embarrassed by this notion that he was unable to get the better of this 15-year-old teenager. But he never really knew. He never really knew. And Frederick described this moment. He described this moment as the absolute revolutionary turning point of his existence, the absolute revolutionary turning point of his existence, because he was able to assert his selfhood, and he swore that he would never be beaten again in that way. But I must call your attention to this point. It wasn't until about 3 years later that Frederick escaped to freedom. Frederick was still in bondage for about 3 years. And he says across all three of his memoirs, I was still in bondage, but I made an inner vow to myself that I would never again be in bondage in spirit. And at the first possible opportunity, I would be free as a physical fact. At the first possible opportunity, I would be free as a physical fact. Now, as I mentioned when I started out telling this story, it's very important that this story not be unmoored from its historical origins, which is why I've spent some time describing it to you. It belongs to an individual, it belongs to a time and place, and those cultural associations must be honored. But I believe we also honor Frederick Douglass by extrapolating universal moral principles from his memoirs, from his speeches, from his outlook. I believe the man himself would have wanted that. And I believe that if you find yourself in a situation of desperation, if you find yourself confronted with cruelty and it's absolutely withering away your psyche, your morale, your life, I do believe that even if you're incapable of separating as a physical fact at this very moment, you can and you must take a vow to be separate from your tormentor internally to the greatest extent possible, and to separate as a physical fact, maybe also as an economic fact, at the soonest possible opportunity. Maybe it will take 3 years. Maybe it'll take 3 months. Maybe it'll be sooner than all that. But it's impossible to exercise. It's impossible to experience your own sense of human agency if you find yourself around people who deplete you. And I know that during this pandemic, when many of us are homebound, there are some of you who are in domestic situations that are unhappy, and perhaps more than unhappy. And you may be feeling, as many people are, a terrible sense of pressure, a terrible sense of stress, because a domestic situation that you do not want to be in is one in which you find yourself all the more tightly confined. And the message that I want to say to you is, you're not wrong. You're not complaining. You're not spitting in the wind. You don't need, in my view, someone to come along and tighten a few screws and straighten you out. You need to get away. You need to get away. And I realize that might not be possible today. But take this internal vow. Take this internal vow to get away from cruel people, to get away from people who deplete you as an inner fact, and make it real as a physical fact at the soonest possible opportunity. So that's one outlook that I want to share with you today. Here's another. I really believe in my heart that the greatest way of unifying your psychical energies, the greatest way of exercising your powers of thought, both from the perspective, again, of everyday cognition, but also in a more causative, psychical, extra-physical way, is through focus, is through absolute focus. And I want you to listen to this very carefully. I think very often, maybe due to conditioning, maybe due to peer pressure, we're not sufficiently honest with ourselves about what we want in life. I think in the same way that we repeat certain psychological principles that may have merit, but may not be applicable directly to your situation, I think that we repeat things by rote to ourselves that we think we believe. If I was to ask you, what do you want out of life? You might have an answer. I might have an answer that arrives very quickly. Maybe too quickly. I want economic liberation. I want to have enough money to, buy health insurance, be secure. Okay, that's fair. I want to break through with my art. I want to break through in my profession. I want a promotion. Maybe you're in the Army, and you're looking to move up the ranks. Maybe you're a martial artist and you're going for your black belt. Maybe you're a salesperson and you're trying to break a certain goal. These are important things and they matter. But what I'm asking you, and I really want to give you liberty, if I may, to do this. What I'm asking you is to really, really, really permit yourself to sit down in a very sustained, mature, and private way and ask yourself, without any preconditioned thought, without any prejudice, without reference to anything that you've repeated to yourself before, what do you really, really want in life? What do you really want? Because I believe that over the course of time, we repeat things to ourselves by rote, and these rote repetitions can obfuscate even more than they reveal. And I also believe that even when we're thinking within the confines of our own head, so to speak, we still feel a sense of peer pressure. We still feel a sense that we have to arrive at a response that's going to make us look good in the eyes of other people, or we need to arrive at a response that's going to make us look good to our internalized images of ourselves. We worry sometimes, without ever expressing it, that to name what we want, to lay our finger on what we want, will somehow make us seem selfish or unspiritual or self-centered in some way. And yet, I believe that your development as an individual, your capacity to get where you want to be in life, will give you greater agency in all kinds of ways, will make you a person that's able to do things for others, if you so wish, that will be more effective, that will be more powerful. I guess what I'm really trying to say to you is, I want to give you the liberty for an afternoon to forget about words like selfish or spiritual or material, or forget about what your neighbor Mike might think of you, or what you think he might think of you, or even what your spouse might think of you. I just want you to be completely at liberty for just an afternoon or an evening or whatever it is, some time that belongs to you and you alone, to really privately ponder and consider what you want in life. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Again, if I ask you what you want, answers will come, but maybe they come too readily. Maybe they come too quickly. Sometimes, for example, we might say, well, I want such and such a job. Well, do you? Perhaps what you really want is the security that goes with that job. Perhaps there's some other means to security. Perhaps there's something else that you want, and we all do it. We confuse the means with the ends. I'm asking you to think from the ends. I'm asking you to think from the ends, because it's not uncommon that there prove to be many different ways of taking the road to wherever you want to go. There might be 10 different roads leading to some place that you want to go, so to speak. And we limit ourselves if we think in only terms of one road, but we can't even get to that point unless we're frank, really frank, with unembarrassed intensity about what we want. So first of all, I want to ask you to think very, very clearly about what you want. And I hope you enjoy this process. This is not meant to be some heavy or dreary thing. This is an exquisitely intimate, personal experiment. And I want to invite you into it. You don't have to tell anybody what you're doing. And personally speaking, I suggest not telling anybody what you're doing, because when you tell people, you're inviting in peer pressure. And we've all got enough peer pressure. This is your experiment. This belongs to you alone. And then when you feel you've gotten to that place where you really know what you want, I would ask you, and this is not so easy, but I would ask you to really, really narrow it down. Really narrow it down. Really create and establish in your psyche one absolute aim that you want in life. And I know that can be tough because life places many demands on us. We're parents, we're workers, we're caregivers, we're artists, we're students, we're all kinds of things. And each one of these things places a valid and legitimate demand on us. But I believe that life makes a very tough, but potentially extraordinary bargain with us. It's a very tough bargain, but the payoff can be just extraordinary. And that is, and dig this one, barring some extreme countervailing measure, like a health crisis or political crisis, you do get what you want in life, but only if you are absolutely certain and focused as to what that is. Now, that's a heavy statement that I've just made, and some of you might be feeling with real justification the need to push back at that and to argue with that and to say to me, no way, no way. All kinds of things happen in life that are tragic. All kinds of things happen in life that are difficult. I have lots of things I've wanted that haven't come to pass. I have lots of things I haven't wanted that I seem to have an abundance And I understand that. I do understand that. I do. But I'm asking you to take a second look. Take a second look. I've made the point, and it's worth repeating, that we do not live under one mental super law, not in my philosophy, not in my outlook. We live under many laws and forces: economics, politics, social forces, health, physical decline. These bodies that we occupy, they're all going to decay and decline. We're all going to experience mortality. That alone tells us that we live under multiple laws and forces. There's never been any exception to that. So I'm not saying there aren't countervailing forces. There are. But I'm also saying that we as seekers underestimate the powers and the possibilities that reside within our own psyche. We underestimate the extent to which we, almost in a certain sense, if I could use a mechanical metaphor, we program ourselves like a homing device or like a heat-seeking missile. And we move continually in the direction of all kinds of things, including repetitions, including repetitive problems, that we might not realize we have a very decided hand in shaping, including in, and participating in, because we are strangers to ourselves, because we live too accidentally, because we don't acknowledge to ourselves that which we really want. And the best way of harnessing the full powers of your psyche, as I'm describing them, is one absolute definite aim. And I mean to be very narrow, very specific, and very, very focused. And again, it can seem very tough because, as I've said, life places multiple demands on all of us. Can't be avoided. But I submit to you that one well-selected aim can cover a lot of different bases, a lot of different bases. And that one well-selected aim could improve the agency and the ability that you possess to, let's say, serve as a leader, or to come to someone's rescue, or to correct injustice, or to earn money that might have very, very important uses, like education, or healthcare, or travel, or something else. One well-selected aim can cover a lot of different bases. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be called upon or face demands from other parts of your life. But I believe that there is no single greater guarantor of getting where you wish to go in life than the possession of one single, definite, and absolute aim. And I really mean this to the extent to which everything else is secondary. It doesn't mean it's unimportant. It doesn't mean it doesn't place legitimate demands on you, but it's secondary. It's a tough bargain. I did say it was a tough bargain, but it's potentially transcendent. It's potentially transcendent. I'm reminded of a popular expression that you'll hear throughout our culture. And the expression goes, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Probably most of you have heard that expression. I asked myself one day, is that expression true? And where does it come from? People are always warning us. Money can't make you happy. A relationship can't make you happy unless you're right inside yourself. Success can't make you happy. Well, I don't know. I believe it's up to you to find that out for yourself. I'm always struck that, people who have money are always the ones who say money can't make you happy, as if they're returning it, or people who are famous tell you fame can't make you happy, take it from me. It's like, well, you just spent your whole life getting famous, and you certainly enjoy the fruits of it. Are you giving up the fruits, or are you just handing out advice? I'm not saying they're wrong necessarily. I'm just saying that I want you and I to verify these things for ourselves. So I looked into this expression, which we often hear and we often nod our heads in agreement with. Careful what you wish for, you just might get it, as if the thing wished for might become a worse pair of handcuffs than whatever you traded for. Could be true, but just because it gets repeated doesn't mean that it's true. There are lots of old prejudices we're throwing off today. There are things we might have accepted just 20 years ago that today no sensitive, decent person would accept. So why should you accept therapeutic or psychological ideas that you've heard all your life? Maybe we can explore them together. Maybe we can verify them in a real way. So I went searching for the origins of this expression, and what I found is it It appeared in the mid-19th century in an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson, but in a little bit of a different form than the one that's become popularized. Emerson was paraphrasing the German philosopher Goethe. And what Goethe basically said was that what you wish for when you're very young will come upon you in waves when you're old. So be careful. So be careful. What you wish for when you're young will come upon you in waves when you're old. So be careful. Now, again, it's one of these statements that many sensitive people would want to argue with and say, hey, that makes no sense to me at all. I wished for lots of things when I was young that didn't reach me, and lots of other things that I didn't wish for did reach me. So how can you defend that statement? Well, here's my point of view. I think because of time intervals, or at least the perception of time, we often exist in a state of forgetfulness. We forget what it was that at one time or another we sought out to worship or to destroy, including when we're very, very young. I think we suffer from an immense forgetfulness and fail to match up effects in our world with causes that not always, but sometimes, and I would say more often than we think, begin with us, the individual. And I would ask you, here's another personal experiment, one for you to do privately. You don't need to share it with anyone. It's your inquiry, it belongs to you alone. I would ask you to think back to the earliest dreams and fantasies you had as a very, very young person, maybe going back to your earliest stages of conscious cognition, of the shaping or of the formulating of conscious memories. For some of you, this might be age 3, age 4, something like that. You start around age 3. You start to remember your dreams, your nighttime dreams. You start to formulate fantasies consciously and with memory. These things are probably all going on at much younger ages, but we seem to have the capacity for shaping long-term memories starting around age 3. So I invite you to really peel back the onion of your psyche. Really, really peel back the onion of your psyche and to ask yourself, what were your earliest memories, fantasies, dreams, visual pictures of yourself in terms of self-image at a very, very young age? And is there congruency between things that you pictured at that very, very young age and who and where you are today? Going back to these early memories can be so important, not just because of the search for antecedents to our current behavior, but because they'll give you a real sense of who you imagine yourself to be, who you imagine yourself to be. Because around age 3, 4, 5, we're not fully in the grip of peer pressure just yet. And I think peer pressure does a lot to scramble our psyches and our sense of self. It kind of conditions us to think in terms of how I should be pleasing somebody else, what I need to say so that my friends are happy, what I need to say so that my teacher is happy, my parents, and so on and so forth, whoever's in authority, and that can be peers. I think if we give ourselves the liberty to think back to those earliest memories, we will find our conception of self. You will find who you are, because I believe self-image is the single greatest decisive factor in life, not the only. Again, there's other things going on politically, economically, health-wise, circumstantially. There might be, I don't know, some geological event tomorrow that none of us have any control over. Obviously, it's going to affect us. But I think that self-image is the ultimate, or is the principal, not the ultimate, the principal cause of things that happen to us in our day-to-day lives. It's very, very important. I believe, and you must determine this for yourself, you must determine this for yourself, that scouting out your self-image from when you were very, very young will produce to you a congruency, will reveal a congruency between what you thought and picturized then and how you live, what your relationships are, what you do day to day, hour to hour, now, today, in the here and now. I want to make a side note before I continue on with this question of self-image. I've been very clear with you, and I'll say it again, that we live under many laws and forces. There's no one mental super law. And I also believe that if you, for example, are suffering from a crushing depression or crushing anxiety, what I'm saying, I believe, can help, but doesn't mean it's the only thing you need to engage in. For example, psychopharmacology might be a very good thing and a very positive thing for you to engage in. There's nothing unspiritual about taking an SSRI or any other kind of drug if it proves helpful to you. These are things that I do myself. And I feel I have to be self-disclosing with you about that, because if I don't, I'm subtly misleading you. I'm suggesting I'm the man with the plan, and here's what you need to do to lead a strong existence. Well, I believe what I'm saying is part of what you need to do to lead a strong existence. But if that includes talk therapy, if that includes taking a psychopharmacological drug or some other drug, why would you not avail yourself of that? I believe in taking a multifaceted approach. Don't let anybody persuade you that it's somehow unspiritual to take a pill. There's all kinds of things that we need to do in this world. Make sure it's right for you. It's not right for everybody. Might not be necessary, but it could also really help you. I've met lots of people, and I would have to say to you, seeker to seeker, I'm one of them, who have benefited from psychopharmacology. That doesn't mean that my search stops. That doesn't mean that I don't do all the things and more that I'm talking to you about, but that's one tool in my belt. So I just want to make it clear to you that you should not feel guilty, or you should not feel pressured by anybody that you're being somehow unspiritual or that you're cheating if you avail yourself of any number of things, because this life is tough. This life is tough on us. This life is tough on us, and I don't want any tool to be taken off the table. These things are also very individualized. What's right for you might not be right for somebody else sitting next to you, and vice versa. But find out what's right for you. Now, I've spoken of the importance of self-image. I believe self-image does so much to direct our energies and determine the compass point of our existence. Obviously, it's true that many of us have problems with self-image. If we didn't have problems with self-image, there'd be no need for a program like this today. If we didn't have problems with self-image, if we didn't suffer from deeply felt but dysfunctional emotive assumptions and misuses of psychical energies, there would be no addictions. There would be no problematic ritualized behaviors. There would be no repeat behaviors that prove ruinous, but that we keep doing them over and over. We'd all be just fine. We could make up our minds about something and that would be that. But we're in pieces. We're in pieces. And I think part of the reason we're in pieces is because we're torn apart by a self-image that may be limiting and hampering us in some way that we don't fully understand. And that may be limiting us and hampering us in ways, again, that go beyond ordinary interactions, that may be influencing our lives in ways that we don't fully see or understand, that may be influencing on our lives that are non-local, that go beyond the strictest cognition or psychological responses. So what do you do? What do you do if you find yourself deficient in some way, if you find yourself being self-harmed in some way by a self-image that may have developed at a period of time where you felt perhaps very inferior or very frightened or very threatened, or maybe you weren't around people who treated you with appropriate respect, and a negative self-image got cemented very early on. Can self-image be reprogrammed? Can it be improved? I believe the answer is yes. It requires great persistence, but I do believe it's absolutely possible. And I say this because I've experienced it myself. And everything that I'm speaking to you about today, I'm speaking to you seeker to seeker. I'm speaking from personal experience. In fact, the only empiricism that we have on either the spiritual path, the ethical path, the path to know yourself, is experience, is conduct, is altered experience. I'm not interested in fantastic stories to tell you about visions that I've had or anything like that. I'm interested in improving life next Tuesday. And I mean that. You know, sometimes you encounter people who feel that they've had some amazing unfoldment or experience, and you know, they want to tell you about some epiphany that they've undergone, and you know, you're listening and you realize sooner or later this is like somebody telling you where they've been on vacation. You know, okay, you visited Tibet, you don't live in Tibet. Okay, you visited Mexico, you don't live in Mexico. Okay, you visited Egypt, you don't live in Egypt. I mean, you're showing me vacation pictures on your phone, but and that's great, but that's not defining necessarily of who you or I am as a person. In the same way, talking about amazing psychical experiences, well, okay, but what does it mean when you take the elevator down and then you're back at street level with the rest of us? Does it really change the ordinary hours of your daily existence? Does it change what you do on Tuesday at 3 o'clock? Does it change how you treat somebody in your workplace Monday morning at 9:30? If it doesn't, what is it other than a photograph from your vacations? What is it other than a selfie that you or I took at the top of a pyramid somewhere? It doesn't necessarily change the individual. And what we're interested in this brief time together is change. So how do you address questions of deficiency in self-image? In the early 20th century, there was a French mind theorist named Émile Coué, who I'm a great admirer of. Coué, in the early to mid 1920s, made 2 lecture tours of the United States. For a period of time, he was very popular in the US and in Europe and other parts of the world. And Coué was famous for a mantra that he created, a sort of self-toning mantra. It was very simple, and if you haven't heard of Coué, you've probably heard of this mantra, and it was this: day by day, in every way, I am getting better and better. Day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. And critics heaped ridicule on Coué, and they said, this is ridiculous. This is completely childish. How on earth could any serious person believe that the repetition of such a sing-song little mantra could make a difference in anybody's life? This is a joke. And Coué, who died in 1926, he was forgotten. If he's referenced at all today, very often he's remembered as some oddity of the 1920s. The 1920s, you know, were considered, at least here in the US, the jazz age, an age of, you know, rum runners and gin and the Charleston and jazz, and kind of a strange, weird, frivolous time in American history just preceding the Great Depression. And Coué is sometimes remembered as a peculiar guy, an odd guy who was part of that time. But I value Émile Coué's career very deeply, and I think he was misunderstood by his critics. And I want to offer his method to you, but I want to offer his method to you in a full way, not a way that's caricatured or stereotyped. Yes, it is correct. Coué came up with this mantra: day by day, in every way, I am getting better and better. But the genius of what he did was not in the words themselves, but was in how he prescribed using the mantra. And it's very, very simple. Coué was trained as a hypnotist, and he was part of a school in France. He lived in northwestern France. was part of a thought school in France called the Nancy School of Hypnotism. And the Nancy hypnotists, who were active in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Nancy hypnotists, they were really the first ones in modern life who identified hypnosis as a psychological or a therapeutic tool, who believed that hypnosis could be used to help the individual who perhaps was suffering from anxiety or suffering from obsessive thoughts or some kind of, some sort of unwanted aspect of emotional life, of mentality. And Coué came to believe that the hypnotist could play a part in strengthening the individual's self-image and sense of physical wellness. But many people obviously do not have access, for one reason or another, to a hypnotist. And it's not something that's necessarily always available or widely available. So Coué came up with a program of self-hypnosis, which he referred to as conscious autosuggestion. And Coué's program was to use his mantra, was to gently whisper it, repeat it to yourself 20 times, just before falling asleep at night, in that exquisite state where you're very relaxed in your body. And again, just as you're coming to in the morning, again, in this state of very deep relaxation, where you might be experiencing waking dreams or hallucinatory images, but you have bodily awareness. You have control over your cognition, even if you're very immobile, even if you're very still, even if you're still in a state of semi-sleep paralysis or just in a very, very deep state of relaxation. And Coué said that this period of time, again, just these few precious moments before you drift to sleep at night, and these few precious moments, just as you're coming to in the morning, are a state of unique suggestibility. They are a natural hypnotic trance that every one of us enters into twice in 24 hours, just at night as you're drifting off, just in the morning as you're coming to. Today, Coué had a very, very early instinct for all of this. Today, sleep researchers refer to this state as hypnagogia, and they study it because it's a very unique, supple, suggestive time for you. It is a time in which the rational barriers of the mind are lowered. Again, you might experiencing, your eyes are closed, you might be experiencing dreamlike imagery, you might be experiencing hallucinations, so to speak, but you still have control over your cognition. You know what's going on. I'm laying here, I'm in my bed, wherever I am. You're conscious, but you're also in a kind of very morphing, very surreal sense of psychology. Images appear in your head, like the images that might appear in a Salvador Dali painting, where landscapes bend and morph. And as I mentioned, your rational defenses are lowered. Your rational mind, your sense of perspective is lowered, which means that new suggestions that you introduce to yourself of who you are and who you wish to be in life can bypass the rational apparatus of the mind that might otherwise reject these suggestions. Hence, hypnagogia is prime time for reprogramming yourself. And Coué suggested using his mantra day by day in every way, I am getting better and better, repeating it, whispering it gently to yourself, just 20 times, that's all, before drifting off, 20 times before coming to in the morning. And he suggested, you don't have to do this, but he suggested knotting a string, tying a string 20 times and keeping it in bed with you or at your bedside so that you could count off your 20 repetitions, almost as if you were reciting a rosary. Because he didn't want you to start to use the rational apparatus of your mind, which sometimes comes into play when you start counting, and he didn't want you to rouse yourself. He wanted you to remain in this very, very deep, gentle, supple state, and then just to drift off to sleep. Now, I mentioned earlier in my presentation that we have evidence in our world today of extra physical capacities of our mind. And I mean that very seriously. I started off by talking about a field that's not controversial, which is neuroplasticity. Nobody challenges the data, but very few medical professionals are willing to explore the implications of the data. Here's a field that's more controversial, and that is psychical research or ESP research. But I promise to you that what I am about to describe to you is described with great sobriety and great accuracy. Serious psychical researchers, starting in the 1970s, going through the 1980s, conducted a series of experiments on subjects who were placed into a state of hypnagogia, the state I've just been describing. It doesn't have to simply occur at night or in the morning. It can occur any time of day. It's just a drowsy but wakeful state, that's all. And so serious psychical researchers conducted a series of experiments called the Ganzfeld experiments. Ganzfeld is German for open field. And what they would do is take two subjects. One subject was considered the receiver, and they would take the receiver and they would place this subject inside of what we might call an isolation tank into a very comfortable state of sensory deprivation. They might allow the person to recline in some sort of a lazy boy recliner chair. They might fit the person with earphones emitting white noise, put eye shades on the person, induce the person into a deep, deep state of conscious relaxation that basically is hypnagogia. Then there was a person outside the isolation tank who this subject was called the sender. And in the Ganzfeld experiments, the sender would attempt to convey an image to the person inside the tank. So let's say there might be 4 images, ordinary things, you know, a duck, a boat, a rocket ship, a house, whatever. 3 of the images would be decoys, so to speak. And the sender was attempting to transmit one image, an actual image out of the 4, to the person inside the tank. So the person inside the tank, let's say, has a 25% guess rate. But across thousands and thousands of trials, different individuals and all the subjects as a whole, according to a meta-analysis of the data, would show a consistently above average hit rate when placed in a state of hypnagogia. So if you're in this experiment and I ask you guess at 1 out of 4 images, well, you know, your guess rate is obviously going to be 25%. But what if over thousands of trials, your guess rate is 35%? And there's just no getting away from this. And we look for pollution in the data, we parse it, we jury it, we subject it to peer scrutiny, critical scrutiny, and again and again and again, you and the group as a whole, through meta-analysis, are showing a higher than average hit rate. This has been recorded to occur in hypnagogia. And lest you think that I'm sticking my neck out too far, because obviously ESP experiments are controversial. In my view, they shouldn't be. Structuring an experiment using the scientific method is just a matter of impeccable conditions. If your conditions are impeccable, then I don't see how the results themselves can be controversial. You have to warrant that your conditions are right. If your conditions are right and they're unpolluted, well, you find what you find. I mean, that's as pure science, pure and active science as you can get. You know, the man who designed these, or one of the people who designed these Ganzfeld experiments, was a parapsychologist named Charles Honorton. He died very young. He was in his mid-1940s. He died in the early 1990s. And it's a real tragedy because he was a very foresightful figure, but unfortunately, he had suffered from health problems most of his life and he died at a young age. But Honorton, who was a great scientist, structured these experiments impeccably. And there's a critic, a skeptic, who's still living, whose name is Ray Hyman. And Hyman is a psychologist, now a psychologist emeritus at the University of Oregon. And Hyman is a dedicated skeptic of ESP research. He does not believe in the ESP thesis. But he agreed to sit down with Honorton and to go over the books impeccably and to review the data. And these two men, the parapsychologist, Charles Honorton, and the skeptic, Ray Hyman, they co-authored a paper together. In which Hyman agreed that the data was unpolluted. He said he did not believe in the ESP thesis. He thought Honorton was wrong about that. But he agreed that the data was absolutely clean, the methodology was absolutely clean, and the conditions were absolutely clean. And he, with Honorton, concluded that we have seen statistical anomalies in laboratory settings, and it warrants more research. Isn't that wonderful? Think of how many human problems could be solved if we could get together and say, well, let's just take a look at this. It's all about a delivery system, isn't it? What's the best way to structure something? What's the best way to structure something that gets the result that we presumably all want? If we're looking at scientific data and we say, well, what do we want? Well, we want the truth. We want to know what's going on. We want to know what's around the next corner. We want to know what's over the next hill. That's all. We want the truth. Well, maybe we can't agree on the truth, but maybe we can agree on the methodology to get to the truth. Maybe we can agree to sustain a question, as these two men did. And I speak somewhat wistfully about this because after Honorton died, this kind of dialogue was really never achieved again. Now, I write a fair amount about ESP research. I care very deeply about it, as you can probably tell from my description. And I encounter skeptics who want to push back against what I'm saying. And it's very, very difficult to have a constructive dialogue because I don't know if this is typical of our times or perhaps it's always been with us. But one of the features of our intellectual life today is that people don't want to win a debate. They want there to be no debate. They want to flip over the chessboard, so to speak, so that there is no debate. There is no question. For this reason, ESP research of the type I'm describing has been eliminated from most college campuses. There used to be ESP research labs at Princeton, at Duke, at Cornell. These are all gone. The skeptics have succeeded. They have succeeded. And I think it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's a self-destructive victory because we can't defer questions about human nature. We can't defer the question, who am I? And if part of who I am is a being who has an extra physical existence, that can actually be measured by statistics in ESP studies of the type that I was just describing to you, well, don't we want to know that? What's the point of walking around repeating know thyself if we don't want to actually undertake experiments of self-knowledge, which is what I hope I'm offering to you during this presentation. So the point that I'm making to you has several different facets. One facet is that apart from what I believe, apart from what you believe, apart from what your next door neighbor believes, we do have concrete evidence that's as strong as any statistically backed evidence, including studies of pharmaceuticals, that tells us that there is an extra physical dimension, there is an extra physical capacity to your intellect. And this extra physical dimension, this extra physical capacity may not always be as far away as it seems. It may be intermittent. It may not always be consistent. I certainly don't think it's consistent because there's lots of other things going on. We're in difficult emotional states sometimes. That's part of why these experiments, these Ganzfeld experiments using this hypnagogic state are valuable, because they tell us that when we are in a deeply, deeply relaxed state, and remember, you enter this state of hypnagogia twice a day, drifting off and coming to, when we are in a deeply relaxed state, when we're able to still the noise, so to speak, all around us, including the chattering voices within us, that seems to be prime time for some kind of extra physicality. What does that mean to you from a practical perspective? We don't really know. It's a very tantalizing scent trail, but we don't really know. And part of the ideas that we later test in laboratory settings begin in very personal settings. So I'm inviting you to begin in a very personal setting. If you feel that what I'm saying is appealing to you, if you feel that some act of self-reconditioning could be positive to you, could perhaps strengthen your sense of self-image, I invite you to recite a mantra of any kind. I gave you Kue's mantra, and that might be a good one to start with just as an experiment, but you don't have to. You could just devise your own mantra. I devised my own mantra. I can tell you for a fact, I literally almost never go to bed at night, and I literally almost never wake up in the morning without using that period of hypnagogia for visualization or affirmation. And who knows what's going on? If it's a time in which the rational defenses are slackened, then it would seem to be prime time for self-reprogramming your own sense of psyche. And if it's a time in which there's some sort of telepathic activity, as was measured in the Ganzfeld experiments, maybe you're able to reach out to someone who can meet you halfway, who can help you with something, who can help provide a solution to a problem. These are open questions, but they're not random questions. They're informed questions. And I believe that all of the things that we've briefly considered in our time together today are things that can make a concrete difference in your life. I believe these are things that you can experiment with and in application, and come to a greater sense of self-agency and come to realize that whatever the challenges are that you face, and they are many, you possess greater resources than we have been led to believe. So on that note, I am going to turn things back over to Mark, our moderator, because he has some questions from library patrons and others, and we have about 15 minutes left together, and I'd like to do my best to respond to some of these questions. So thank you, Mark.
Super. Thank you, Mitch. Much food for thought there. Yeah, well, so our first question is, what can I do to keep my kids cheerful and focused on the positive when we don't know if they're going to school or not? I guess we could say how to, interpreting it through your lens, how do you instill, positive thoughts in children and sort of a slight meditative state? Obviously, children are pretty wild.
Yeah. It's a toughie. I'm the father of 2 boys, and I understand what people are going through in terms of attempting to maintain a household, maintain a work schedule, be the teacher, be the administrator, be the disciplinarian, be the everything in terms of the challenges that the lockdown has placed on all of us. I really wish I had some golden nuggets of wisdom to offer you. I make it up every day as I go along. I make it up every 5 minutes as I go along. But I would say one of the things that I've personally come to appreciate is that the very instant we display something, and I can assure you, this was not something I understood earlier in life, and this was not something that even as I speak these words to you now, I am always able to act on. I'm not going to put up some front that suggests I've got it all tied up into a nice little bow. Far from it. But I have learned that, we're told that we teach by example. And I think that not only is that true, but that we don't fully recognize the depth of that truth, because the manner in which I behave immediately becomes almost a menu choice for my kids. And so if I demonstrate anger or some other negative emotion, and I do, because our emotions and our intellect are 2 different things, and they run on different tracks. But if I display some sort of anger or negative emotion, that immediately translates to my children as a menu choice, And I am very concerned about that. Now, when I fail, and I do fail, I try not to flagellate myself. I just say, okay, I failed. And so for the rest of the afternoon, I'm going to try it again. I'm going to try to do better. Um, it depends on your household, but sometimes there are days I think we just have to take it easy. Sometimes I think that we ask too much of kids. Uh, I, I, I mean, when I was a kid, all I remember is riding my bike around the neighborhood, getting involved with this and that, sometimes good activities, sometimes bad activities. My parents weren't around very much. And today, kids' time is very, very heavily structured, which can make the lockdown all the more difficult. But I think we have to accept our own helplessness sometimes and say, look, there's just only so much I can do. I might want to limit screen time. I might want to limit phone time. I might want all kinds of things, but life is just going to be upended for the next few months. Hopefully we're going to go back. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to go back to what we knew as normal before. And maybe that's good in some ways, but we're certainly going to go to something. And this is going to change. This is going to change. And sometimes I just think we need to give our kids and ourselves slack until some change occurs.
Great. So we got another question. I just wanted to transition to it kind of based on the first question, your response to it. Is I tell my daughter, and I picked it up from your book, The Miracle Club, which is in turn, picking it up from New Thought, which is thoughts are causative. So be careful, be mindful of what you think. Don't think, I suck. Think, right now I feel like I suck. That's the transitory thing, right?
Very important point,
Yeah, so the question is, lost my job, worried about benefits running out. This is on my mind constantly. How can I stay positive and a healthy outlook, in such a situation?
Yeah. That's a very big question. And I don't want to respond to it by rote because everybody is in an economic situation that is unique. Some people have savings, some people might have VA benefits, some people have no benefits at all. The healthcare situation in this country is beyond abysmal. I mean, most of you listening hardly need me to tell you that. I feel very, very, very seriously about that. And I think that first and foremost, I would say this. There are times where we must use our passions, and there are times where we must use our intellect. And those are two different things. And I think we have to become schooled in using both. What I was describing about repeating mantras at night when you're in the state of hypnagogia, that absolutely does help with self-image, I believe. I believe it can also help to program you and maybe something more in certain directions. But it's important that the mantra that you use, first and foremost, be emotionally persuasive. If you say, I'm abundant, and you don't have money, your rational mind is going to reject that, and it's not going to do any good. But if you say something else that's maybe more of an interim step, your rational mind may be more prepared to deal with that, and that may help, among other things, get you where you're going. I would also say, I mean, that's sort of a uses of the emotions in a certain sense, and you're also using your body, you're using your physical apparatus when you're in a very relaxed state. At other times, we're called upon to use our intellects. And I would suggest to you that it's profoundly important in an unemotional way. There are times where emotions come into play. There are times where intellect has to come into play. It's profoundly important in an unemotional way when you're in a crisis situation, like an economic crisis, to sit down and really, really write out potential possible solutions, expenses that you can get rid of even if you don't want to, possible sources of earning money and take nothing off the table. And also write down as a goal what you need and what you're trying to accomplish, and keep that forever and constantly on your mind. I have to say the following. I'm a really big believer in small things. I think small things done with absolute commitment can make a difference. And I believe that the small act of writing down a goal, being absolutely self-certain about it, feeling unembarrassed certainty, sharing it with no one, keeping it private and carrying it with you, can help to focus the mind in ways that may go beyond the given, in ways that may go beyond what we believe. There's lots of other things we have to be doing as well. I mean, we live in the world of Caesar, and we have to deal with some of the burdens that Caesar places on us. And obviously, the solution to a crisis economically, just as the solution to a crisis psychologically, as I was talking about earlier, is going to be multifaceted. Take nothing off the table. Take what I would call a D-Day approach. Use everything available to you. Use whatever you can possibly do from the perspective of hypnagogia and the reprogramming of the mind. Use whatever you can possibly do in terms of formulating an absolute definite goal. Use whatever you could possibly do intellectually in terms of listing possible solutions and taking nothing off the table. I can guarantee you this. Our psyches contain greater power than we were raised to believe. And that absolutely can be part of the solution. And I feel for what you're going through. I believe in your capacity to approach this maturely, and my deepest wish for you is a quick and expeditious resolution.
And our final question is a very wide one. I thought coronavirus was bad, but now we have social unrest too, and there's so much pain around. They're worried, about the army coming in and all these things that we're so unused to. So the person is saying they're worried literally about everything. What kind of world are we going to give to our kids, which I think existed as a thought before this, but
sure.
What kind of techniques does New Thought and Positive Thought and Awakened Minds offer us towards not losing hope and trying to envision a future that's personal and global?
Well, that question must be on the minds of everybody. I can't imagine there's anyone watching who doesn't feel that question intensely. And you're absolutely correct. Anybody who's not profoundly concerned about what you've just described is got their head in the clouds, is simply not paying attention. And I imagine that's very, very few people. So what you're describing is profoundly important. I think that one of the things I believe we have to, as individuals, push back against in our own private sphere of existence is we must not give in to this default position that exists in our culture today to respond to people sarcastically, to use rhetorical questions, to engage in debasement of other people. That doesn't mean calling out injustice, not at all. But we often debase other people for purposes of entertainment. This is just gossip or tale-bearing. The language over social media is very often language of sarcasm, of bickering, of rhetorical questions. And as a result, we have reduced our capacity as a human polity to think together. And I really believe that it is incumbent upon each one of us as individuals, and it is also possible for each one of us as individuals to conduct ourselves with impeccability, to absolutely refuse to be drawn into pointless bickering, to be drawn into gossip as entertainment, to be drawn into spreading rumors or nonsense or silliness, to refuse to be drawn into frivolity and triviality. That doesn't mean escapism is wrong. We all need escapism. But, there are certain things that, up until this point in our history, recently, I think a lot of our entertainment, for example, was based in seeing other people humiliated. A lot of so-called reality television is really nothing other than getting thrills out of seeing another person humiliated. And I do believe that takes a toll on the psyche after a period of time. I also believe what we think and say about other people enacts the same autosuggestive function in ourselves as when we're saying or thinking something personally. I think these things color our perceptions of reality. It's almost impossible to see a trait in another person that we don't detect in ourselves, whether that's in the positive or negative. So for example, a dishonest person does not appreciate honesty in another person. He sees it as weakness, actually. he sees it as weakness. So if you're trying to make a point to somebody and you find that the other person isn't trusting you or doesn't understand where you're coming from or whatever, and that this just can't be corrected, it's probably because the value that you're espousing just isn't shared by the other person. You know, if you say that something is an act of injustice and somebody else tells you, you know, no, it's not, and you're trying to explain your point of view and you feel you've done as much as you possibly can, listen, it's just possible that the person you're talking to just doesn't care about questions of justice. And that's unfortunate, but that is a fact of life. There's a lot of us on this planet, and our values differ. So hang around people, associate with people who you have positive shared values with. Don't get lost. Don't waste your time, including on social media, dealing with people whose values diverge from your own. It is not easy. It is not easy. I get hit with, you know, every kind of comment that you could possibly imagine. And it's all I can do sometimes, just to keep walking, keep walking. But it's important because we mustn't validate unethical behavior. We may need to fix it in terms of policies that protect people, but we mustn't validate it. So don't spend too much time, if you can avoid it, getting into arguments with people who don't share your values. Don't spend time gossiping or talebearing or talking trash about private people. Don't debase yourself with reality television or entertainment that really just takes the form of humiliating other people. Avoid chronic sarcasm. You know, sometimes sarcasm is funny, obviously, and it has its place, but it was never meant to be just the normal mode of discussion among all of us. Avoid rhetorical questions because they deter thinking, and they usually keep us from getting down to the essence of what somebody thinks or what we think. They keep us from getting down to the essence of who we should be dwelling among. The Italian novelist Ignazio Saloni said, what is basic in life is the choice of one's comrades. So choose your comrades carefully in every walk of life. Don't spend too much time on people who you don't share values with. And again, model a behavior for your kids, for your neighbors, for your workmates, for people you collaborate with. Model a behavior that gives those individuals a sense of a new menu, a fresher menu, a better menu, off of which we can all choose behaviors that are fortifying. I hope that helps.
Sure it will. Well, here's to a kinder world.
Amen.
From day to day. Before you leave us, we are going to have some show notes after we wrap up, which we're going to do very shortly. The resources we have in our library, resources that some of them you've written, some of you've written introductions for. We have some resources by Neville, who I know is a very important thinker to you.
For real, yeah.
And, so we're going to do that, but I just wanted to ask if you wanted to say anything about, because I'm looking forward to this, and we're going to get a copy, The Miracle Habits, which is your next book, which I believe is due out in July, which I'm very much.
Right. Yeah, thank you. The Miracle Habits is a new book that is coming out July 14th of 2020. I'm very excited about that book because in that book, I really try to espouse all the ideals that we've been exploring today, all the exercises and more that we've been exploring today, but to really marry and to really wed those things to a stark bluntness and a stark honesty about the difficulties people face in this world. I started writing that book just before the corona epidemic began, and I continued to write it while the lockdown began, and it really instilled me with a tremendous sense of responsibility not to offer anything to the reader that didn't take full account of the challenges, the difficulties, the problems that he or she faces in life, especially now in this period of heightened crisis. This crisis was certainly felt before corona, but it was felt in a much amplified way with corona, and now, of course, with the protests that are leaving an important mark on our society. And in The Miracle Habits, I really ask people to allow their sense of self, their sense of agency, their psyches to soar, but none of it at the expense of a really sober assessment of the profound difficulties that we all face. So my hope is that it's really a book for the moment. I hope it's a book of metaphysics that really responds to people's needs in the here and now.